speaker today will be Dr. Jeremy Greene from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Greene is an MD, MA, PhD. He's the William H. Welch Professor of Medicine and the History of Medicine, and the director of the Department of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins. He's also, I should say, an associate faculty at the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Hopkins. Dr. Greene received an MA in medical anthropology from Harvard in 2004 and received his MD and PhD degrees in the history of medicine, also from Harvard. Then completed a residency in internal medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in 2008, and has been a board certified internal medicine physician since then. In addition to his appointment at the Institute for the History of Medicine, Dr. Greene also practices internal medicine at the East Baltimore Medical Center, which is a community health center affiliated with Hopkins. His research work has been widely recognized with many distinguished awards, including, for example, the Roy Porter Award from the Society for Social History of Medicine, the J. Worth Estes Award, and the Richard Shyrock Medal from the American Association for the History of Medicine, the Edward Kramers Award from the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy, the Rachel Carson Prize from the Society for the Social Study of Science, and most recently, Dr. Greene was named in 2021 for the Nicholas Davies Award as a recipient from the American College of Physicians for, quote, outstanding scholarly activities in history, literature, philosophy, and ethics, and contributions to humanism in medicine. The first two books that he wrote by Dr. Greene were published by Johns Hopkins. The first one was called Prescribing by Numbers, Drugs and the Definition of Disease. And the second book was called Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine, which describes how the relationship of knowledge and practice and medical science and the pharmaceutical marketplace can be understood by understanding the complex histories of medical technologies. Dr. Greene's current book project is tentatively entitled The Electronic Patient, Medicine and the Challenges of New Media, and that will be published by our University of Chicago Press. That new book examines how changing expectations of communications through electric, electronic, and digital media transform the nature of medical practice and medical knowledge, and how they're supported by, and how he's supported by a faculty scholar fellowship from the Greenwald Foundation and an award from the National Library of Medicine. Dr. Greene's talk today is entitled, probably related to the book that he's working on, The Technological Fix, Presence, Absence, and the Limits of Telemedicine. Dr. Greene, are you on board with us yet?
So we'll just hang tight until he hops on and makes himself visible, and then he'll get started with his talk.
So I'm excited by the range of books that he's written, and the one that's coming out now from the University of Chicago Press on the electronic patient.
Good.
All right, thanks so much. So I'm assuming Dr. Ziegler has already given the introduction that's needed, and really brief is better.
I did, and I emphasized the fact that the new book you're writing on the electronic patient medicine and challenges of the new media will be published by the University of Chicago Press.
Oh, that's right. A good point. It's a good point. It's a local team. And I'm very sorry that I can't be joining you today in person, partly because were I joining you in person, the rest of my schedule would not have encroached to have produced my lateness. So they scheduled me with patients in clinic up to the moment that I was supposed to be giving this talk. And then when the interface didn't work, I had to scramble. So I'm just going to need a moment. I've literally run in from a car right now. And what I need to do is quickly get a copy, get the tech set up so I can do it. So I don't know, Dr. Ziegler, if there's any more stalling that you're capable of. I've probably taxed about as much stalling as I can expect, but maybe like 1 or 2 more minutes would. I don't know if you know any good but appropriate jokes to tell about telemedicine.
I'm waiting to hear your jokes on telemedicine. Yes,
it's a good point, and historians do try and follow humor as a form of as a way of tracing culture. But okay, here I've got my talk up. I have yet to find any truly funny jokes about telemedicine, and perhaps that's a high bar to hold. I'm interested in knowing if anyone in this group has encountered any. I can use this as a sampling device as well as a platform. Okay, so let me see if this is working. I'm going to try a share screen. Hopefully you can see my slides now.
yes.
Yes? Okay,
Yes.
fantastic. Yeah, and then if I play, then my second hope will be that hopefully you don't actually see my my notes. Do you see my notes?
Nope, it's perfect.
Fantastic. All right, and well, thanks again. Thanks for sticking with this so far. And this is not entirely just a flippant comment that, I think we've all experienced in some ways this challenge, right? All the things that telepresence opens up, both in clinical and non-clinical realms. The fact that we're able to be here having this conversation, even as we are within the space of whether you want to call it epidemic or endemic at this point, and I'd love to get into the history and challenges of that later. The fact that we can be sharing a conversation together is something that is going to be post-dating this pandemic, right? So I don't think we're going back to just purely in person. I think telepresence has altered our lives in some substantial ways that will continue. But I think there's also substantial challenges, the way that our time is compressed, the ways that, even in my clinic today, I work in a community health center in East Baltimore. Some of my patients are there in person and others are still virtual patients. And I, as a clinician, used to older habits of just looking for the flags on the hallway to see who's in a room or at what stage of visit they are, can miss the fact that a patient is waiting for me. In fact, it happened to me just earlier today, because that hybrid basis of telepresence is still something to be used to. So my talk today is titled "The Technological Fix: Presence, Absence, and the Limits of Telemedicine." And let me see if I can. I feel like I've almost got all the technological fixes not there. But I want to use my time today to frame a set of promises and problems that new communications technologies have posed for health and medicine. And my talk is drawn from this forthcoming book. Its current title is "The Doctor Who Wasn't There," and you can make your own jokes about me in that title for the first few minutes of this talk if you'd like. The Doctor Who Wasn't There: Technology, History, and the Limits of Telehealth. And I want to ask you about the limits of technology and their ability to solve social problems. So the question here: can the right technology undo widening disparities in access to healthcare? And this is an important question and not one to answer glibly. So telemedicine, telehealth, which so many of us have been rocketed into in the past 2 years, was initially promoted as a tool to reduce disparities in healthcare. And yet, as so many of us have also learned, the deployment of telehealth from the COVID-19 pandemic has in many cases widened disparities in access to care, even as it resolves others. This is one of many reports of challenges in who actually benefited from telehealth and telemedicine in ways in which these differentially diverge along lines of race, class, and economic status. In my own telemedical experience over the past few years, there was initially a tight correlation between white race, non-Hispanic ethnicity, and non-Medicaid insurance status, and the ability for individual patients to successfully establish telemedical encounters. And this has been borne out in a number of cohort studies. In turn, the pandemic has been a boom time for concierge models of care explicitly built on proprietary telehealth platforms. The membership fees of this organization, and I have no relationship to Partner MD, but I could have chosen any of a number of other proprietary telehealth platforms. But the membership fees of these organizations mark telemedicine as a marker of exclusivity rather than inclusivity, health as commodity rather than health as right. So as a historian, I found this paradox. If you go back to the origins of telemedicine in the late 1960s and 1970s, this technology promised to remove barriers of time and space, to remove the social geographic problems of access to healthcare, that is, to undo social disparities in access to care. And yet in the present pandemic, it seemed to be doing exactly the opposite, accentuating, underlining those differences. So the first theme of my talk today is, does telemedicine eliminate health disparities or augment them? Even before telemedicine existed as it was coined as a word or as a real practice, it already existed as an imaginary means to eliminate geographical barriers and access to healthcare. So you can look, for example, at this image, the 1939 illustration from the famous German Jewish medical illustrator Fritz Kahn, titled "The Doctor of the Future," using radio and television to give a consultation to his patient aboard the ship India and the South Seas. And this is an aesthetic. It's an aestheticized techno-futurism that we're all familiar with on some level. Information technology promises to bring people closer and remove problems of distance and time lag. And I mentioned aesthetics to name a second theme of today's lecture, as all of us have now become scholars and practitioners of telepresence in some form or another, whether or not we're clinicians. Every next Zoom meeting, we also understand aesthetic and affective dimensions these practices have on our lives. Right now, you can probably tell, a little bit upset, and it's not your fault, that I'm not physically there in Chicago with you, because were that the case, I would not have been in clinic today, rushing in this compression of time to then make it to this talk, right? So there are ways in which our lives on Zoom have caused new affective problems that we have to contend with, and new aesthetic problems as well. I'm a little bedraggled, I'll admit. So think for a moment of the design of this Zoom screen right here, the ergonomics of how you are being held in your chair with relation to the screen and camera, or how you've also learned how to mitigate some of the effects of Zoom fatigue, or how you've learned to curate and organize the background behind your camera, right? And perform in a certain way, or perhaps you're much more apprehensive about eating in front of other people where you wouldn't have given it a second thought before because you have to see the food entering your mouth and your teeth chewing. So these are aesthetic and affective dimensions of a technological interface. And we're accustomed to thinking about success stories of design and technology, right? How does good design overcome initial hesitation to embrace a new technology? And this is something well captured in a book I illustrate here, John Harwood's The Interface, which is a history of design at the company IBM, which describes how IBM, under the leadership of Thomas Watson Jr.'s slogan, "Good design is good business," overcame initial critiques of unfeeling automation to generate more ways to speed the accepting of computing in business and personal life. But aesthetics works in both directions. So many encounters with new technologies produce aesthetic or affective disconnects or uncomfortableness, like bad aesthetics. And this is suggested here in this cartoon critiquing bedside manner through the new Bell picture phone after its failed debut in 1964. So today's talk is going to examine the problems of presence and absence in early modes of telemedicine, both on an individual doctor-patient level and on populational levels. So a quick aside, the term telemedicine itself, to the best I can tell, was coined by a Mass General Hospital internist named Kenneth Bird in 1971. Here he is at his console. Bird developed a kind of a laboratory for linking the emergency department of Mass General Hospital, first to a single satellite clinic in Logan Airport, and then to a network of VA hospitals in New England. And he envisioned a nationwide telemedical effort that would fundamentally transform public health and primary care. And Bird's vision of this new media of medical practice took on expanded public health interests in the crucial decade of the 1970s. And proposals soon emerged to use telemedical links to solve existing problems of access in the healthcare system, specifically access to care across far-flung rural areas with complex geographical terrain, and access to medical care, apologize for the dim reproduction of this image, in the social geography of the concrete canyons of what sociologist Anselm Strauss referred to as medical ghettos of inner city New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And Chicago actually loomed large in the imagination of the medical ghetto in the 1960s and 1970s. And here you can see that the tall buildings, replace the cliffs, but their similar technologies promote connectivity in disconnected urban spaces that will also promote connectivity in disconnected rural spaces. Now, in these early days of telemedicine, the federal government took on an active role in how to envision technology as a tool for health equity. Maxine Rockoff, who is shown in this image, was the head of a federal division responsible for assessing whether telemedicine worked in practice. And her field notes, which she generously shared with me from 1971 to 1979, form an invaluable resource into the challenges of how to produce meaningful telepresence for clinical care and public health. But not everyone embraced the promise of telemedicine. Indeed, over the course of the late 60s and 70s, the various stakeholders invested in rolling out telehealth as a new medium: doctors, nurses, engineers, health system planners, community organizers, and sociologists struggled to understand the negative affect and suspicion with which many users, doctors and patients alike, recoiled from the screen rather than embracing it. So what all of these thinkers want to know: did television do to the medical encounter? How could this interface possibly be better designed to tune out the uncanny feelings of disconnect and engineer better doctor-patient relations? So I'm going to get into the meat of the talk in a moment, but again, there's two main parts. First, to explore three key themes in theorizing telepresence as a one-on-one interaction. First, the internal concerns of early adopters like Bird, who wanted to define telemedicine as something that amplified rather than diminished connections between human beings, and take on directly the critiques of Big Brother that they faced. And they used arguments of enhancement. How would television enhance medical communications? Second, to explore the social engineering of doctor-patient relations that were possible through telemedical networks by paying attention to the use of different kinds of lenses or screens, and how could you stage the clinical encounter to actually produce better medicine. And then third, to explore other forms of discomfort that lay not in the dehumanizing potential of television medicine, but in the very liberating potential it produced. That's to say, fears by the medical profession that telemedical encounters actually gave too much power to the patient, produced too much equality between doctor and patient in these encounters, and were concerned that symmetry might actually be harmful, give too much agency to a patient. This is all about the one-to-one dimensions of telepresence. The second part of the talk understands how telehealth was specifically rolled out in the 1960s and 1970s as a technological fix to social disparities in access to healthcare, in a way that referenced both the racialized medical ghetto, as they became understood during America's urban crisis of white flight, as well as the barriers to access in rural health as rural areas became medically understaffed due to a different flight of people and capital to urban and suburban America, also happening in the 1970s. So that's the ballpark. And if you fall asleep or if you lose me, you've already got the basic argument for the talk here. The question, I'll see what I can to convince you along the way, starting with enhancement. So Kenneth Bird's first telemedical field station was founded in 1968 at Gate 23 of Boston's Logan International Airport, where a small satellite clinic for the Mass General Hospital had been set up at the request of hospital president John Knowles, who then later went on to head the Rockefeller Foundation. Bird and another clinician staffed the clinic in person during peak travel hours and were on telephone call by pager the rest of the time. They were on call to these nurses who staffed the clinic 24 hours. And the limitations of medicine by telephone soon became apparent to Bird. Bird had been reading the popular media theorist Marshall McLuhan and was convinced of the value of television as a new electronic extension of man. He sought to extend the diagnostic capacity of urgent care nurses and physicians by adding interactive closed-circuit television links and turning the Logan Clinic into a laboratory for studying how electronic media could improve medicine. He added a set of closed-circuit TV cameras at both locations. There's a microwave link. It was just a few miles away. There were long lenses for portraits, macro lenses for close-ups, special adapters for EKGs, X-rays, and microscopy. And all this information fed into this console I showed you earlier, back at the emergency department in Mass General Hospital. So when the clinic opened in 1968 to great fanfare, the Boston Globe reported, quote, "The doctors are never more than a few feet away from their patients, even though the latter are at the airport and the doctors are at the hospital downtown." Alternately, as a third-year medical student rotating through MGH at Harvard Medical School described it, in Bird's clinic, the doctor's stethoscope is 3 miles long. Now, if this imagery of telepresence invokes a form of science fiction in the present, it was no accident. The medical student and author of the article in question, Michael Crichton, was already a celebrated science fiction author. Just a year earlier, his first novel, The Andromeda Strain, had been published to critical acclaim and optioned as a blockbuster movie in the emerging genre of biomedical thriller. And Crichton was already at work on his second book, 5 Patients, which devoted a chapter to the science fiction already present in the contemporary practice at Medical Station at Gate 23 of Logan Airport. Like Crichton, Bird saw his clinic as a form of science fiction in the present, describing his jet-setting patient population as denizens of the future. People in the airport, he argued, already embraced a technological sublime. They were early adopters. But the mediation of medicine by television came with some perils as well as promise. Bird and his chief technical collaborators, a CBS engineer named Stanley Cranen, focused extraordinary efforts on the problem of reproducibility and fidelity. So if a doctor could see a lesion in a blood vessel of the conjunctiva of a patient's eye in person, would that same lesion be visible to another doctor looking at the same eye on a TV screen several miles away? And this image that you're looking at now, which is from a report in Bird's files at MGH, shows photographs of television screens, which themselves depicted images of the conjunctiva of a model patient at 2 different camera settings. And these images and hundreds other like them constituted a data corpus of Bird's and Cranen's experiments to provide a science of similarity, to show that telemedical diagnosis could be a good enough form of medicine compared to in-person medicine. Cranen and Bird went on to assay visual capacities and limitations of different lenses and video enhancement algorithms, the ability to distinguish key features on microscopic, radiological, and physical examination. And in the early 70s, Bird, along with the telemedical nurse practitioner Marie Kerrigan, who is shown here also as a test subject on the images on the right side of the screen, began to theorize more broadly on the meanings of television medicine for both practitioner and patient. In the telemedical circuit, they suggested, interactive television allows interpersonal communication across distance to recreate and even enhance face-to-face communication. How else could one explain the rapid acceptance of the new media by patients and practitioners at the MGH Logan Clinic? Shared physical space, they suggested, was overrated and perhaps detrimental to the best possible care. This telemedical circuit, they continued, quote, produces an alteration in time and space which actually expands the role of the physician. In fact, the fundamental doctor-patient relationship is not only preserved, but often is actually augmented, enhanced, and seemingly more critically focused. Augmented, enhanced, more critically focused. These are all actually metaphors that have to do with cameras and algorithms of television production. But augmentation was not a positive thing to all parties. By the early 70s, a few other clinics had also set up telemedical circuits to help run remote staff meetings. Here's one in Lakeview, Minnesota, which put a television at the head of the table so that a physician could supervise a remote staff. Now, clinic staff began to complain that the gigantic head of the physician that they were all looking at up on a pedestal created what they called a face of God problem, that the relative power of physicians was augmented too much in a way that made clinic staff uncomfortable. And the clinic staff at Lakeview, Minnesota resolved this by literally taking the TV physician off of the physical pedestal and then putting the TV on the floor so that the staff could look down at the physician rather than up, and they felt much better about this. Now, so much for enhancement, but that story leads us into this next question. If you can do a simple thing like shift the location or the way you're looking down versus looking up, and then actually change power relations in a salutary way for a clinic, well, what other forms of clinical life could be better engineered through television? And the media studies scholar Ben Park at NYU, who wrote an influential report on telemedicine for the Rockefeller Foundation, reporting to John Knowles, who had moved from MGH to Rockefeller, soon became fascinated, along with Maxine Rockoff, about these kinds of distortions. They talked a lot about this face of God problem and its solution. And in June of 1973, the pair met in New York with Park's longtime friend, Irving Goffman, to see if the famous sociologist of everyday life could help them understand what was happening and not happening in videotapes of television links of doctor-patient encounters. Now, Rockoff had read Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life and thought he was, quote, one of the country's leading experts on person-to-person communication. And this wide-ranging conversation lasted for 6 hours and became a flashpoint for both Park and Rockoff's thinking about the sociology of medical encounters and what television could do to them. Goffman suggested, I apologize for the blurriness of this image, that one of the problems of establishing presence in telemedical encounters lay in the fact that the two figures, the doctor and the patient, then inhabited different backgrounds. When two people communicate in the same room, their backgrounds also communicate, and they share the same communication space. We have developed a code for handling such things as a third person walking into the room, Goffman continued. The need to look at reference material of notes, etc. A new code will have to be developed for television interactions. For example, when a person enters one of the rooms involved in a television interaction, the person in the other room is not party to this interruption and feels neglected by the person who turns away from the television set. Now, my dog may walk in here over the course of this lecture. That probably won't throw you too much. But if I began to turn this way and have a conversation to somebody right here, not acknowledge them and not acknowledge you, that would do a lot to our relationship at this moment in time. Eye contact posed further frame problems. Now, eye contact was understood by both medical professionals and sociologists to be crucial to establishing rapport in difficult clinical situations. But the coupling of a television and a camera produces a paradox, and we all know this paradox now, right? If you look at the camera, you give the impression of paying attention and actually looking at the face of the person you're talking to, but you're not actually looking at their face, right? If I look at the screen and I look at your face, then I'm not looking at the camera. And if I look back and forth between them repeatedly, then I just look shifty or discombobulated. And so this question of how does one resolve frame problems of cameras through these links is something that Zoom still has not yet resolved. But the sociological staging of intimacy is also recast as a technological problem of framing. How do you solve this with an engineering fix? So when discussing the face of God problem that I mentioned before, the media scholar Ben Park invoked the work of the anthropologist Edward Hall. Many of you may know Hall's work. He was extraordinarily popular in the 60s, and he introduced a social theory of proxemics in 1966 in a book called The Hidden Dimension. So like Goffman, Hall was attuned to the social study of everyday life, and he specifically drew attention to the different spatial frames of closeness and distance that help to code intimacy and commonplace social interactions. Among white middle-class Americans, the implicit subject of most of medical sociology at the time, Hall described 4 distances of social interaction: intimate, personal, social, and public, each with a close phase and a far phase, in which increase in distance denoted a concomitant decrease in intimacy. And this is a kind of a univariate form of social relations, right? You can measure how close people are by measuring how close people are. It has a lot of appeal. It's a very kind of structural form of sociology. And these are coded precisely in units of length. Social far phase at 7 to 12 feet is a space of formal business and social interaction. Personal far phase at 2.5 to 4 feet is an arm's length distance for discussing sensitive materials. Intimate far phase at more like 6 to 18 inches, you start getting into problems of your eyes crossing, right? But we also know that form of intimacy with people as well. So this distance, what Hall's work promised of advocates of telemedicine is that if you have trouble establishing intimacy and rapport, well, maybe you can fix it just by getting the right focal length of a camera. And that conversely, the choice of wide angle or close-up lens introduced challenges of incorrect distances in the telemedical relationship. Well, what if you actually do have an intimate relationship, but the camera makes you look too far away? How do you fix this with an engineering solution? At what apparent distance, Park asked, does the physician cease to be a friendly symbol of help and become over-domineering or even a threat? So where the physician Kenneth Bird hoped that the new medium of telemedicine could lead to an even more augmented role for doctors in American healthcare, Ben Park and sociologists like Irving Goffman hoped that a new social science involving proxemics and framing could help to engineer telepresence to be more productive and less suspicious, to actually deflate the physician to a level where they could interact better with their patients. But he thought there was a possibility to do something even more radical. So Goffman, Park, and Rockoff proposed 2 options to deal with the framing problems caused by telepresence in medicine. Either first, change the nature of the camera work or setting to help reproduce the kind of space of the doctor's office. Or second, quote, we may choose to take advantage of the technology to develop new forms for interacting. Disrupting the shared background was not necessarily a bad thing, they argued, if it helped to disrupt the steep asymmetry in power relations between doctor and patient, an asymmetry that was supported in part in the controlled space of the clinic and the hospital and the doctor's office. In the telemedicine setting, Park described, quote, the situation may be restored to considerably greater symmetry because the environment, though shared, consists of two spaces. The patient may respond to this greater symmetry in a positive way, such as by showing greater candor, being more relaxed. Indeed, some early results coming out of an early telemedical clinic linking a public housing project in East Harlem with physicians in the nearby Mount Sinai Hospital suggested that many patients felt more comfortable on screen than they did when they were in the same room as doctors. A similar change in power relations took place in the right to touch. In the clinical encounter, the doctor may touch the patient, but if the patient tries to touch the doctor in the same way, well, that would result in a call to security. It's not symmetrical at all. Television, however, restored symmetry to the world of touch. Neither party could touch either party. No one gets to touch. So the idea that telemedicine would disrupt power asymmetries in the doctor-patient relationship was a far cry from Kenneth Bird's original goals, in which television was meant only to augment and amplify, never to diminish the role of the physician in medical encounters. Bird would have been relieved, perhaps, to learn that the medical sociologist Elliot Friedson, whose work illuminated the means by which medical professionals developed and maintained social control, partly through the organization of social spaces like the clinic and the hospital, thought that Park and Rockoff's hopes for the capability of television to restore symmetry in doctor-patient interactions was wildly overstated. Writing to Park, Friedson added, quote, it seems to me that telemedicine makes it possible for everything to be prepped in advance so the doctor can simply come in like a surgeon and do purely functional work. I'm not sure I would argue there is greater symmetry between doctor and patient under these circumstances. If I am right, this is indeed a selling point to doctors, particularly the super specialists who like to make use of every minute to perform their esoteric functions. But I'm not exactly sure this is the best thing in the world for human patient care. As telemedicine became a tool with disruptive potential in the eyes of some medical sociologists and patient advocates, it was also recognized as a tool to clamp down professional control as well. The tool was agnostic. It wasn't that telemedicine did one thing or another. It was all a question of who got to control how it was used. It was also recognized that this was a very American set of concerns, specifically a very white middle-class American set of concerns. At the end of his 1974 report on telemedicine, Ben Park briefly reflected of the limitations of the social framework that he, Goffman, Friedson, and others have been using as something limited, like so much of the 1970s sociological imagination in medicine, to a typical doctor-patient interaction, which often assumed a white middle-class American consumer. Not only did this lead to bias in the cultural dimensions of telemedical practice, but these norms were built into the interface itself. Even the physical structure of the telemedical systems built were predicated on white middle-class American usage. Park noted the red bias of the Plumicon camera, popular at the time, which not only favored light skin tones over dark skin tones, but also detected inflammation on light skin with a different sensitivity compared to detection of inflammation in darker skin tones. So that telemedicine might be the same, as good as an in-person interaction, differentially depending on the lightness or darkness of your skin. Let's pause for a moment, though, I forgot to mention one thing here. Existing disparities in access to health, Park warned, could be augmented through differential access to a telemedical system designed with white middle-class bodies, minds, social groups, and behaviors in mind. I'll quote him, if cultural and ethnic differences can, and indeed often do, make for difficulties in the face-to-face interactions between physicians and patients, does the interactive medium have potential for creating different difficulties? Will people from disadvantaged socioeconomic groups, e.g. ghetto Blacks, reservation Amerins, Spanish-speaking poor, result in problems or opportunities for providing care? Now, I want to pause for a moment because there's some loaded language in that last quotation, and we should linger for a moment on the casual use of terms used to describe the medically underserved as of 1974, ghetto Blacks, reservation Amerins, Spanish-speaking poor. These are not the terms we would use today. But they do reflect a common refrain. Health disparities are understood in terms of Black versus white, Latino versus non-Latino, those who are indigenous versus non-indigenous on or off reservations. And these are the simple binaries that we still often think of when we think of health disparities today. Now, the hope all the same was that telemedicine could flatten barriers in access to healthcare across all of these boundaries. This is where I want to get with the second part of this talk, which will be much shorter. The term ghetto had by the late 1960s undergone a radical transformation from describing the isolation of predominantly Jewish populations, first in European and then in cities around the world, to firmly, by the mid-1960s, being associated with African American and Latino marginalization within American cities, specifically in urban areas marked by white flight, the newly pathologized inner city. John Norman, who is a figure depicted on the cover of Modern Medicine here on the left, was one of the first Black cardiothoracic surgeons in Boston and a member of a 1969 Harvard Medical School committee on relations with the Black community. And he described in the book that he edited on the right here called Medicine in the Ghetto, that a medical ghetto affected communities of patients and practitioners alike and needed to be addressed. His colleague, John Holloman, a New York-based physician and civil rights activist who criticized the racist exclusion of African Americans from the American Medical Association that was still in practice in 1968, noted there was a tendency for many ghetto residents who view the establishment of satellite clinics, neighborhood health centers, and the like with some suspicion. Often when we look about us, it is very easy to discern the correlation between interests, where none existed before, in our community, and the large sums of monies available for study, demonstration, and renewal. Yet wary as Holloman was of demonstration projects, he nonetheless held out hope that telemedicine might produce new forms of community responses to an enduring social problem of health disparities along racial lines. He repeatedly pointed to the emerging technology of telemedicine as a possible solution that could be in the community's control, insisting, quote, two-way closed-circuit TV can be established to link the ghetto physician to the medical center, services that could be put into operation almost at once. Oh, sorry, there's the quotation. I should have given you that earlier. Holloman became head of the public hospital system in New York City at a time when New York State enacted what was called a ghetto medicine program to fund ventures linking academic hospitals to inner city areas. This building here you see is part of the Wagner Homes project in East Harlem, and it became the site for a federally funded telemedicine link to the Mount Sinai Hospital mentioned earlier to demonstrate the role of this technology in expanding access to care to inner city Black patients. Headed by a second-generation African-American physician in the Mount Sinai Department of Community Medicine, Dr. Carter L. Marshall. So Marshall was aware that many East Harlem residents often resisted setting foot in the hospital until they were so ill as to be beyond the reach of medical help. He hoped that the right kind of communications platform could help bring them to care of an earlier stage of illness and at an earlier stage of life. Marshall envisioned a pediatric outreach program that could reach directly from Mount Sinai Hospital into the structure of Harlem's tenements and public housing projects themselves using an expanded network of medical television. So Marshall had written a 1972 book on the dynamics of health and disease that detailed the social factors that led to disparities of access in healthcare in the inner city. He's not just a technologist. Quote, there are two ways you can look at problems that involve the delivery of health services, Carter told the New York Times shortly after establishing this first link between Mount Sinai and Wagner Homes. One of them is to fix the structure of the healthcare system itself. The other is to use technology to circumvent these fundamental problems. Our interest here, he continued, is how we can adapt technology to the delivery of health services, regardless of the organizational framework. Marshall was surprised to find most children and parents were immediately receptive to getting direct medical care over the television. In several cases, patients were more communicative with their healthcare providers over television than in person. He speculated either, quote, the child is probably very familiar with television and views every occurrence on the screen as entertainment, or, quote, the nurse is less threatening on television. She cannot, for instance, give an injection over the television. Harlem's New York Amsterdam News, a critical New York participant in the Black press, echoed this assessment. Quote, the children love it and are more willing to come to the clinic now they can be on television. An early report to the National Cable Television Association, the Mount Sinai team explained their plans to expand this cable link to other health stations, schools, daycare centers, and ultimately into every home in Harlem. So this program, the Wagner Homes Project, was announced as a success story that showed, quote, television could overcome the sociocultural gulf that separates inner city residents from healthcare resources. But if the real goal was to provide good care to as many urban residents as possible, some studies of the data suggested that the television itself was less important to that success as a technology in itself than as a means of enabling nurse practitioners to operate more autonomously in neighborhood community health centers. Imagine a network of 5 Harlem clinics linked to a central consultant in the Mount Sinai Hospital, economist Charlotte Muller argued in this article. And she calculated that each link might take roughly 5% of the supervising physician's time, allowing 20 nurse practitioners in 20 clinics to be supervised by a single full-time physician. Muller argued that the flesh and blood nurse practitioner had more to do with overcoming problems of distance and access than the television or the televised physician themselves. But by the time her analysis was published in 1977, the television link between Mount Sinai and Wagner had already been shut down. By 1975, the federal demonstration project was complete. Having proved the efficacy of telecommunications with nurse practitioners in delivering care to residents of an urban housing project, the National Center for Health Service Research dryly noted that as a successful demonstration project, quote, "This project has gone about as far as it can go." Without political will for implementation, a demonstration was just a demonstration. This is also the case with one of the most successful federal demonstrations of telemedicine in addressing rural health disparities. And I'm only going to mention it briefly. I've written a separate article on this with some collaborators, but this took telemedicine on the road, literally in a souped up Winnebago, retrofitted by NASA and Lockheed engineers. The Humpty you might have noticed in the top was a satellite dish fitted for microwave communications. Open the door and you're surrounded by levers, switches, remote controlled cameras, monitors, and self-correcting sensor devices, all built to spec for NASA by the aerospace and defense giant Lockheed Missile and Space Company. And this is called the StarPack MHU, a prototype mobile health unit with telemedical technologies designed to deliver state-of-the-art healthcare in out-of-the-way places. Now, StarPack is an acronym that's short for Space Technology Applied to Rural Papago Advanced Healthcare. And it was an unusual collaboration between NASA, the Indian Health Service, and the Lockheed Missile and Space Company between 1973 and 77. It was also the largest federal investment in telemedicine. The budget dwarfed all of the other demonstrations combined. In this project, the sparse landscape of the Papago Reservation, now known as the Tohono O'odham Reservation in southern Arizona, where most residents lived several hours drive away from the nearest health post, would become a testing site for adapting medical technologies planned for long-term manned spaceflight, but bent towards improving rural primary healthcare. So media coverage at the time made the comparison between Indian and astronaut explicit, emphasizing that common environments of absence and isolation prompted similar problems for the Papago, a people, quote, as isolated from medical care as if they lived on the moon. For NASA, the mobile health unit was to play the part of a space shuttle, orbiting a course in the desert far from any hospitals and clinics, and then receiving patients along its route, allowing a test of what ultimately became the new sick bay of the new space shuttle. Any patients that entered would find themselves inside of a high-tech vehicle linked to a command center with cutting-edge telemedical equipment, relayed through powerful new communications and computer systems that connected the mobile health unit to a live consultation with doctors stationed back in a medical command center back at the Indian Health Service Cells Hospital at the center of the reservation. Now, this system, a mobile unit with paramedical personnel connected by telecommunications to a medical command center, was meant to be a perfect terrestrial test of the medical system being designed for the first space shuttle. Lockheed was also interested in selling it if it worked as part of technological aid packages to developing countries. But it was also sold to the Indian Health Service as a means for the IHS, which had been a technological laggard in many ways, as a way of being in a cutting edge use of new technologies to reduce health disparities and access to healthcare in out-of-the-way rural spaces. So I don't have the time to tell the full StarPack story here, but the impressive thing about StarPack is that it really worked quite well at delivering quality diagnostic and therapeutic care and at generating very high patient and provider acceptance. From NASA's perspective, the project was a successful demonstration. The space shuttle project moved forward with a new medical bay based on the technology used in StarPack. That's how the space shuttle got going. For a few years, the Indian Health Service could also claim success, that it had its own new R&D office. When did the Indian Health Service ever have an R&D office? And it was at the forefront of applying space-age technologies to real-world public health problems, with real possibilities for both domestic and international applications. But StarPack left a mixed record of success and failure for the Papago tribe as well. Some of the nearly $4 million budget supported enduring infrastructure projects, especially road building, which is really crucial to connecting the nation. Yet while StarPack provided them living in remote villages more convenient access to healthcare services, it could not contribute a lasting solution to the persistent problem of coordinating medical service and communicating medical information on the reservation. So what happens is shortly after the demise of the StarPack system, and the mobile health unit winds up being mothballed and sold off to a Northern Arizona university where it's then used to televise college football games. But after this, The state of Arizona funds a Arizona Health Science Center in Tucson to create statewide telemedical systems designed to address many of the problems that StarPack was developed for. But even though Arizona has one of the most sophisticated and well-built telemedical networks for rural healthcare in the country, the Tohono O'odham Nation is not part of the now extensive and internationally renowned Arizona telemedicine program. So both of these projects, the Wagner Homes project in East Harlem and the StarPack project in Southern Arizona, they both worked. They both demonstrated that primary care could be delivered through telemedicine to offer real benefits to previously marginalized populations. But they both failed as well, and that neither of them lived past the demonstration phase. Direct federal investment in telemedicine as a system to reduce barriers to access to care dried up. The demonstration was just a demonstration. And in the interim, as telehealth has developed, it's been increasingly a private affair in this country, an area of speculative capital and market development, rather than a coordinated program to ensure a public right to health for all. Yes, telehealth has increased access to healthcare for millions of Americans, especially in rural areas, over the past several decades, and played a crucial part in our ability to deliver care in the present pandemic. But also in the present pandemic, we've seen an acceleration of a structure laid down in the prior privatization of the field. Those who benefit most from access to telehealth have not been the have-nots, but those already on the upside of the digital divide, those who were already savvy on how to access care. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of telepresence, though it is stated only briefly in the archives that I've used to write this book. A system that promised increased access to healthcare actually contained within its very structure forms of racial and ethnic bias that work to increase rather than decrease disparities in access to healthcare. In the United States, with the increased uptake of telemedical care in the present pandemic, we find this uncomfortable truth amplified in front of us. And in retrospect, there seems to be a fundamental disconnect with the kinds of things people were trying to fix and engineer when they were optimistic about what telehealth could do, with attention to framing, distance, set design, use of lenses, that is focusing on the machine aspect of things. And the belief that somehow this technology could magically overwrite the steep social determinants that map out a geography of access and lack of access to healthcare in this country. So in the early experience of telemedicine in its first decade in this country, we examine a forgotten moment of the socialization of an emerging medical medium. And in this iterative projection of the uncomfortable aspects of the telemedical interface, we can see very clearly that they make different parties uncomfortable for different technical, sociological, professional, and aesthetic reasons. So all of this is still moldable, is still malleable. As we face a new telemedical future and a relentlessly telepresent present, it's worth pausing for a moment at the combined efforts of physicians, engineers, and sociologists and activists to address the potentials and pitfalls of this potentiating but troubling interface, so many of which have now become part of our everyday experiences, manifest as much in the unusual sense of fatigue so many of us still feel at the end of the day working in telepresence, but also in the joy that we can take in participating in conferences like this one from so far away while we still live our lives in newly enforced modes of physical separation. Thank you for your attention today, and I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Greene. So I will be the Master of Ceremonies today because unfortunately Dr. Schwartz, our other beloved Master of Ceremonies, could not make it. So if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you. And I see that Jay, you can start us off.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Dr. Greene. Can people hear me okay?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks for your talk. One, excuse me, one thing that comes to my mind when thinking about sort of telehealth and it's sort of the potential limitations of it is it's perhaps it would be much easier to implement this, especially in rather remote rural areas, if there was, say, like widely accessible, say, broadband. And so, that's, I'd imagine that's one sort of like sort of structural factor that's limiting this, the capabilities of this new sort of medium. So, I mean, to a certain extent, that is obviously a political consideration that's well outside the scope of what hospital institutions can't make it the case just unilaterally that broadband is accessible. But I'm curious if your sort of research has sort of what sort of discussions have been made about how does that affect? Is that actually so much of a limiting agent as it might seem to be? So yeah, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jay. I really appreciate it. And this gets at a whole suite of problems of how to properly use history in this space, right? Because there's always this challenge of adopting the Santayana. Those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. But I prefer the Mark Twain line, right? That history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so the problem of like what it means to conceive of a telemedical technology is not the same thing from the early 1970s to today. And the problem of what it means to be able or not be able to access broadband is also not the same thing, right? So where are the similarities and where are the differences? And the reason I'm pointing that out is I do think that the cost of broadband and the relative inaccessibility or the uneven accessibility was a substantial infrastructural problem in the 1970s that actually looks quite different today. And one of the reasons I point this out is that smartphone uptake at this point in time in the American population is so very high, right? And is in many ways disconnected from questions specifically of divisions of race, ethnicity, urban versus rural locations, or household income, that I think the availability of internet connecting capacity is no longer the bottleneck that it actually was in the 70s, right? So, but there are many other things that become a barrier in that space, right? Conversely, there are other things that open up, and I'm interested in the experience in this room. I think one of the things that when we think about symmetry in relationships, those of you who have done telemedical practice, many practitioners appreciate the ability to see a patient in their home. And it's kind of, some people would argue that telemedicine has brought back the house call in a new kind of a way. Or to see people in their place of work, which was often not even possible with house calls, right? But I would tell you, so many of I work in a community health center. I work with a community of patients that are sort of below, above, oftentimes near the poverty line. Many of the patients I've been seeing in televisits lately have been in Amazon warehouses, on their phones, driving forklifts. And on the one hand, it allows them to have access in a way they wouldn't have had otherwise, because oftentimes, like people with more precarious forms of work can have a harder time leaving work for a medical visit. At the same time, I find myself thinking, well, this is not an optimal telemedical encounter. This is not the same as me connecting with someone who has got a good display with a nice like ring lamp that they've set up in their home and a large screen to work with. And I'm perorating on the subject a little bit, but what I'm trying to get across here is even in this encounter, right? It's not that these patients I'm talking about don't have access to broadband. It's just that it's being mediated through a smartphone in a work environment, and it's certainly not optimal compared to having a home broadband and display. So it's not that the digital divide has been erased, but it gets reconstituted. I answer that question as well because some people have made analogies to what has happened in public schools over the past 2 years. My kids are both in Baltimore City public schools, and they've been issued, Chromebooks, and those who didn't have internets in their homes were issued, portable Wi-Fi and MiFi stations. There was a real effort to actually make sure that access to broadband and computing technology would not be the barrier. But I think that has certainly not leveled the playing field of all parties. It's been an important move, and it's different from where things were in the 70s, but it hasn't leveled it. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'll lean back and listen to more.
Great, thank you. So Peggy, the floor is yours, and then there's a great question in the chat that I'll get to.
Yeah, just a comment that it's obviously not a one size fits all, and while you've outlined how this doesn't work well for on the basis of race and class, it works really well for a lot of disabilities. So both mobility and hearing. But I'm not so sure if it works for deaf people. I actually don't know, but for hard of hearing, it's a big bump up.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, Peggy. And I did not mention it in the talk. A different chapter in the book focuses more on intersections of technologies of telemediated care and disability, but you're entirely right? So it opens up spaces. And so one way that I would like to reflect on that question is that when physicians, oftentimes older physicians, sometimes like me, cis white male balding physicians, complain about what is lost in these telemedical encounters as sort of the decline of some former human interaction that has now been degraded, right? That to focus on that voice alone and not understand ways in which for many other publics, actual forms of agency and connection have been enhanced, right? And one of the questions is, how do we create a pluralistic mode of governance and decision-making in which we actually have space to engage these things together? So your comment is incredibly important. I appreciate it.
Great. So from Dr. Lucy Lester in the chat, she said, do you think that the uptick in telemedicine as necessitated by the pandemic provided the quote, last nail in the coffin for the hands-on physical examination of the patient? And if yes, do you have concerns about this?
So I can give a firm no there. That there are clearly elements that require physical presence in medical care at this point, right? I think the kind of mechanistic interface that would do that would have to involve some sort of complex haptic suite coupled with a sort of a form of point of care ultrasonography or other forms of visualization that would be able to be kind of OTC marketable to consumers as well. So I'm not writing that out as a possibility. But I think what I'm trying to say, and I would also defer and be interested in other teleclinical experience and other people on this call, is part of the challenge I have. Any given day that I'm in hybrid clinic, there are people that I see for a video visit, and it's just a great lament that if they had just been here, there are things that I could have done, but now I need to send them to the emergency department. And it's not that all of my work in urgent care is trying to keep people out of the emergency department, but it is a great and wasteful place if there's an ability to use the link. But then there's a tremendous amount of work where things that used to be a barrier to getting care, assuming that patients needed to make their way into a clinic, can be obviated if there's a home blood pressure monitor and ability to actually do a meaningful follow-up through a video link. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the medical profession is both continually laments the loss of physical exam, which understandably, but also at other times over fetishizes the physical exam in a place where that co-presence is not needed in three-dimensional space. If that presents a barrier to someone getting meaningful feedback in a short-term loop, I think one area in which this has been really well demonstrated is in the treatment of patients living with heart failure. That living with congestive heart failure, what's most important is to have tight loops and titrating, reasonable responses. So oftentimes, if you can do things with a scale and do daily weights and have regular phone contact and actually get yourself better to a target, rather than having to wait, 6 weeks and to see a clinician in person, and then wait another 6 weeks to get another titration. So this might be a peroration. I may just be speaking just to the internists and cardiologists in the audience at this point, but there are these spaces in which we've learned that insisting on physical presence can actually be inimical to good patient care. And then there are spaces in which physical presence is absolutely essential. And so it's coming back to that question of good enough. The book itself, Telemedicine, is only one part of it. There's really 4 parts, and it follows remote care through telephone medicine from the late 19th century and the early 20th century. What happened when radio technologies enter medicine, both as diagnostic devices, communicating devices, telemetry devices, or ways of paging physicians and ambulances. Then the television, and then the last section is on mainframe computing and networked computing. And one of the interesting things is from the very beginning of the story in telephones, there's this question of, well, what is it that we can do well by the telephone? And where is it we really need that person to come in? So it's almost like thinking carefully with telemedicine can give us a more critical sense of what really matters in the physical examination, rather than, killing it off outright or putting the last nail in the coffin, as you said. But thanks for that question.
Richard and Luke go. So Amy said in the chat, to what extent have you seen in your research the digital divide present for people with disabilities in terms of tech access? I think that's a really important question.
That is a great point. I wish I knew more to answer that in the present day. I've found less about it in the historical record. I do think that in recent years, though, certainly in the context of the present pandemic, the sense that Well, I mean, this is a critical aspect of the insights from disability studies, right? Like, what do we take for granted about the built environment? And as we think about the built environment as something that reflects our own values and gives or takes away agency and personhood, depending on how we decide to build interfaces, right? Then the disability studies perspective is key to even my ability to mount a critique on what we're doing when we produce telemedical systems that augment racial and economic and ethnic disparities, because it's, in a sense, the problem is taking for granted the interface, right? So I think part of what we learn is by insisting on differential interfaces. And I'm just going to lean back into kind of a non-clinical vein and think about a bit about Zoom. So what are we doing right now in this conversation right now? Is captioning available for you? I'm not sure. And Elena, this is not a dig at you at all. I'm just asking this as a question.
Yes, but I only have the capability to assign someone to type the captions at the moment, which sounds like a big job. So.
No, that's fine. And because I've been involved in organizing conferences in which we try and work on accessibility, and we struggle with the fact that even when we use Google's real-time Zoom captioning, right? Like if we have, like, it will caption me much better than it will caption other participants, right? As someone with a mid-Atlantic accent, I think there's gender differences in how well captioning works. There's sort of dialect differences, and you know, I've learned a lot of this by collaborations with Jaypreet Virdi, who's a remarkable historian of deafness, disability, and medicine at the University of Delaware. And we threw a conference together, a virtual conference on medical technology, histories of medical technologies. And you know, she helped us plug in captioning software, right? And on the one hand, well, Zoom makes things more accessible, right? And yet at the same time, it wouldn't caption her voice as an individual, you know, like living with deafness and so with an accent that comes from deaf society as well. Like, and so the ways that the disability studies critique is necessary to understand both what we achieve and the failures that are still built into these systems that can be changed. It's the focus on the interface that I really want to draw attention to and the choices that we make.
Definitely, yeah. The software, the AI reflects the opinions and views of its writers for sure. All right, Richard and then Luke, feel free to go.
Jeremy, very nice presentation. But one of the things that I think has happened, the clinical examination has changed well before this COVID-19. The laying on of hands, when we were, you know, this is 50 years ago, if you didn't do all these things, you were an inadequate physician. And I think that's changed, antedating this, you know, the COVID-19 and everything. The other thing I just wanted to comment, the backgrounds you mentioned that, you know, unequal. Isn't like Elena's background, couldn't it be a choice for, you know, the patient? They may be embarrassed, you know, that there's dirty laundry and all sorts of things and kids' things piled up behind them. And so I think as Elena has done, that it could be a background. Would you rather have this and even have the doctor in a, you know, similar, not necessarily, you know, if we're talking about a really poor, but something that's more equal. It seems to me that could be done, and that might help a little bit.
Yes, I think it's a really good point, and I think this is one of these points that stretches also between the clinical and the educational. And there are some interesting ways of looking at the comparison between what happens with telemedicine and what happens with teleeducation. I conclude the book actually by talking a bit about Sesame Street as a demonstration, as a federal demonstration project to actually use television technologies to reduce disparities in education that isn't just a flash in the pan in the 1970s and something that actually winds up being incredibly successful. And I don't want to draw that analogy too closely, but it's just to say, well, what would have happened? What could have happened had a sustained investment in actually telemedicine for equity and access to healthcare been given after a successful demonstration project in the 70s, like was given to the Children's Television Workshop for Sesame Street. But part of it is just to say, you know, when you look at children in public schools or even those of you who are teaching undergrads, you know, the decision or not decision to share video at all, which really affects the ability to create co-presence, does move along these axes. There's questions of shame, questions of like unpredictability of what's happening in the space behind one. And these are interface questions. So, you know, Alina's background, just to, you know, you've called attention to it, you know, several times. It's a wonderful background. I have some I've lost my backgrounds. I don't know where they went, but I was actually using a bunch of illustrations from Fritz Kahn for a while. One of them, my favorite, was the one where he places you inside of a human sinus as if it's a windswept field. But these are elements of the aesthetic dimensions of an interface that can give agency, right? And I think part of what you're getting at is, like the ability to see a patient in their house, in their life, can be liberatory, or it can feel constraining and prying. And how do you give a patient agency over that? Something I've been waiting for Zoom to do is to build in the ability to have music as a play in or a played out for when you're awkwardly waiting, for example, for a speaker that shows up 5 to 10 minutes late. But the interface can continue to be speculatively rethought. I think if we get back to Thomas Kuhn, the historian, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean Thomas Kuhn. I'm having a brief brain translocation. I'll come back to me in a moment. The towering historian of technology has this notion of momentum. Hughes, how does one think about, is there a moment in the development of a technological system in which it can be malleable and changed? And is there a moment after which it just becomes fixed and then too many people are invested in it and can't change it? And I think where we are with telemedical interfaces, there's still a lot of space to transform them. The momentum isn't so much that they're fixed. But I'll stop talking again.
Q&A and into a break.
Thanks, Dr. Greene. That was so well researched and so interesting to listen to. I have 2 comments and 1 question. So first one, I'm in maternal fetal medicine. I think we've realized that telehealth has been an occasion to reflect on the purposes of our visit in the first place. I mean, we've noticed that for low-risk pregnancy patients, prenatal visits are really excessive. They're not necessarily indicated every 2 weeks, 1 week, especially when you're just stepping on a scale. The other comment I have is I see a rise in the advent of e-consults. So one clinician might e-consult the next clinician to say, hey, is this worth an actual in-person visit? So do you have any thoughts about how this actually might take some agency away from the patient being involved in the care? In that, you don't have, you just might have clinician A talking to clinician B about, some maybe low platelets or whatever it is, rather than taking the patient out of kind of that model. Does my question make sense?
I think so. If I understand it in 2 parts, the first is, how do we focus on the ways in which we actually help design systems that help patients have better engagements with the healthcare system, right? And you're mentioning sort of different aspects of low-prob prenatal checks, right? So how do we get to the point where folks can feel that they're actually getting something that is at least as good, that there's not an anxiety that somehow they're being irresponsible and missing something by not coming in person? And I do believe, as much as I can criticize, Epic, which has become the sort of the behemoth electronic health record system that Hopkins uses, and many of you likewise also do, there are elements of the MyChart system that have been so very effective at helping patients develop, get greater agency over the way they get their care. And so one of the questions is, what's the reflexive governance practice and who's involved in that, such that we actually insist that these new systems actually benefit all parties? And there's the question where, much as I mentioned earlier, it's not like telemedicine is going to create a more human doctor-patient encounter or a more inhuman one, right? Telemedicine is agnostic to that question. It's a question of who controls what telemedicine is and continues to be, right? It's the loop, it's the reflexive loop that we put back in. And so I think here some of the work of the sociologist Ulrich Beck in science studies. He wrote a remarkable book called Risk Society, but Beck is very considered with governance. Like, how do we have a tight enough loop, kind of analogous to the congestive heart failure feedback loop, such that we see how it's working, we see what the promises are, we see whether people are being affected in the ways that they're supposed to be, and then we titrate. And we keep on changing the interface. We keep on tinkering with active participation, rather than think about it as a monolithic block that either makes the world better or worse. And I think that may help get at your second question as well, although there's a dimension of your second question that fascinates me, which is to say, I hear you partly saying that different practitioners will have different levels of judgment about who should be seen or not, that might have to do with their relative experience and inexperience in the field, like are they an intern or have they been practicing for 40 years? Or might also have to do just with their position or how they communicate or how they feel about technology. How do you standardize that? How do you make it such that a patient feels there's a reliable standard for knowing when they need to be in person with a human being? And I don't have the answer to that, but I have an analogy, which is that you see a similar literature develop with telephone medicine. And this question, it evolves first in a very enthusiastic space. You can do, there are oral surgeons, there are folks working with Bell in the 1870s, 1880s. You're like, that's it. Like, no one's going to have to see a doctor again. Everyone around the country is going to have equal access to healthcare as long as they can get a telephone. And they make these stethoscope screw-on pieces so you can hold the telephone up to your chest and use the stethoscope. But then that quickly fades away with critique, right? It's not till the late 20th century that I think you start seeing, after a bunch of medical legal developments, really careful and methodical guides about, well, who can be seen by telephone? What kinds of judgments can be made reasonably by telephone, and which ones require an in-person? So telephone triage, right, becomes a robust discipline, I'd say, in the 1980s. And actually nursing drives it rather than medicine. So the question is, where is that development right now in telehealth? And I don't think it's as robust as we'd like it to be. So I'm highlighting what you're saying. I don't think the standardizing moment to make sure that everyone's making that decision the same way has happened yet.